My name is Nora Bennett. I'm 42 years old, and tonight my daughter has set a 23-seat table. She planned the menu by season and frosted a cake she practiced twice just to perfect the edges. The house smells like lemon zest and warm butter. The candles are waiting to be lit, and her apron still carries a thumbprint of ganache. I can hear her humming in the kitchen, the same nervous tune she hums when she's almost satisfied our family is supposed to arrive any minute. I don't know it yet, but a message is already on its way, and it will decide who gets a place at this table. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever poured your heart into something only to be overlooked, hit like and subscribe, so this story finds the folks who need it. I grew up in a house where polished shoes mattered more than muddy knees, where my parents kept our living room ready for company, even when company never came. My father Robert ran his days by a calendar, and my mother Diane believed presentation could fix anything. And beside me was my younger sister Paige, the sparkle of the family, the one whose trophies always had a spot already cleared on the shelf, while my own wins, small repairs, a handmade lamp, a restored chair were praised with a smile that said, "Be careful not to scuff the floor." I learned early to hold my joy close and keep my hands busy, which is probably why I built our little home goods store from scratch with my husband Mark, who carves wood the way some people pray, steady and without fanfare. Our place downtown isn't glamorous, but the lights are warm, the shelves smell like cedar, and we know most of our customers by name. Money was never a flood for us, but it ran clear and honest, and that felt richer to me than the kind of life where everything looks perfect and no one says what they mean. Still, the gap between how we live and how my parents like to be seen hangs over us during birthdays and holidays like a chandelier that's always 2 seconds from falling. Lila grew up in that space between watching me measure stain into jars and her father coax grain out of a block of maple, and somewhere along the way, she found her own language in food studying, plating the way other kids scroll headlines, tasting sauces with a focus that makes me think of a surgeon, and writing draft menus in the margins of her homework because ideas don't wait for tidy endings. She told me months ago she wanted to handle her grandmother's birthday dinner herself. "No shortcuts," she said, a little breathless. And I watched her plan with a seriousness that felt older than 18, calling suppliers for herbs, mapping out timing, testing a lavender glaze until it held a sheen that looked like morning light on a lake. And I let myself believe that effort would be enough to keep us safe from the old family pattern that never quite died. By late afternoon, the dining room looked like a magazine spread, only kinder mismatched plates wrapped in cloth napkins. She ironed herself. Name cards. She lettered in gold small vases of daffodils because she once told me they look like tiny trumpets announcing good news, and every chair waited for someone we love. I moved through the rooms with a dish towel on my shoulder the way my grandmother used to, taking in the hush before guests arrive, the hum of the oven, the easy rhythm a house has when it's ready to receive. And I could almost picture my parents walking up the path with the wind caught in my mother's hair, while Lila lifted the main course and met them with a calm welcome dinner is served. Underneath that picture was a thinner thread I didn't want to touch, the years of being measured against Paige, of being told to clean my hands before I showed what I made, of hearing that sweet. When what I needed was, "We see you," and I kept telling myself that Lila's generation would be spared it, that we had turned a corner simply by naming what had hurt. When she stepped from the kitchen to ask if the daffodils were too bright against the table runner, I saw a young woman inches from the life she wants, 1 foot in our modest world, and 1 foot toward a school whose brochure she reads like a love letter. A school that sits just out of reach for families like ours, but maybe not forever. And I told her they looked like sunshine, and she smiled in that quick way she does when you've confirmed something she already knew. Somewhere between adjusting the dimmer and sliding tarts back into the oven for a gentle warm, Lila asked if I thought her grandmother would taste the hint of fennel she had coaxed into the sauce, and I said yes because I could taste it too. And for a moment, everything in the room gathered itself into a promise I was almost certain we could keep. The evening air cooled, and the porch light cut a soft circle on the steps, and when I checked the time there were 10 minutes to spare, enough for a last wipe of the counter, a last breath before the doorbell, and my phone buzzed in my apron pocket with the kind of sound that never meant anything more than a reminder or a late RSVP. I didn't think twice as I slid my thumb across the screen, and in that small motion, the picture in my head flickered. The house held its breath, and the first words of a message came into view. The message on my phone was short, 10 words, no punctuation, no apology, change of plans, dinner at the Sycamore, adults only. I stared at it long enough for the light to dim and fade. The guests were supposed to arrive in 10 minutes. 23 people, family, friends, cousins I hadn't seen in months. I looked toward the dining room where everything waited perfect and ready. I didn't answer right away. My thumb hovered over the screen while the smell of rosemary and roasted pears filled the house. In the kitchen, Lila was sliding a tray of candied citrus onto the counter, humming softly as she arranged them in a spiral. Her hair was curled the way she liked for special occasions, and her cheeks were still pink from the heat of the oven. She had worked for days to make everything look effortless. "Mom, do you think Grandma will like the glaze?" she asked, holding the tray toward the light. "I tweaked it this morning. It's more floral now." "It's beautiful," I said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach. My voice sounded strange in my own ears. The phone felt heavier than it should have. I stepped into the hallway and scrolled up through the family group chat. At the top sat my father's message, the same one sent to everyone. I could see that they'd already read it, already reacted with thumbs-up emojis and heart symbols. No one questioned it. Not one person. I called my father first. The phone rang twice before his voice came through, cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "Hey, you get the message. You're not coming." No, we changed plans," he said. "It's just easier this way. We're already at the restaurant." I gripped the phone tighter. "You're there now." "Yep, just sat down. Menu looks great." "Why?" "Because Lila's been cooking for 3 days," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You said we'd host it here. She made food for 23 people." There was a pause, short but cold. "Well, tell her not to take it personally," he said. "She can freeze the leftovers, right?" And then the line went dead. For a moment I stood there staring at the floor, my heart pounding. The walls felt smaller, the air heavier. Then I heard a soft sound behind me. Lila was standing in the doorway, her hands still dusted with sugar, watching my face. "Wait," she said slowly. "They're not coming." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She stepped closer, took the phone from my hand, and read the message herself. A moment later, another notification appeared, my sister Paige's photo. There they were, my parents, my sister, her kids, all smiling around a restaurant table, glasses raised, plates of steak and pasta, already half-eaten. Lila stared at the picture for a long time, her expression blank. Then she turned toward the cake on the counter, the one she had made from scratch with layers of lavender and white chocolate. "We should just throw it all out," she whispered. "Not this time," I said quietly. She didn't cry. She just stood there, her fingers twitching at her sides as if unsure what to do. The silence around her was sharper than any shouting. I could hear her breathing shallow and quick, the sound catching in her throat. "It's fine," she said after a moment, too fast, too bright. "It's just food, right?" But it wasn't. It was 3 days of hope, measured out in teaspoons and recipe cards. It was the hours she spent hand-lettering place cards, choosing daffodils because they looked like trumpets announcing spring. It was the pear tart she made especially for my mother's neighbor, someone who hadn't even RSVP'd. It was every "do you think they'll like it?" she'd asked me late at night. I called my mother next. She answered on the first ring. "Hello, sweetheart." Her voice was sweet, practiced. "Did you really just not come?" I asked. She sighed, the kind of sigh that meant she'd already decided I was overreacting. "Nora, don't start. We thought it would be easier for everyone. You know how crowded your house can get. Besides, we didn't want anyone to risk getting sick. Lila's still so young." "She's 18, not 5, I said. "She sanitized everything. She wore gloves while plating." "Well, that's sweet honey," my mother replied lightly, "but it's not real cooking. Not like at a restaurant." I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. Then I called Paige. She answered with that gentle, practiced tone she used when pretending to care. "Don't guilt everyone over this," she said, before I could even speak. "Lila's being dramatic. She needs to learn that not everything is about her. She made food, sure, but we didn't want to be her test subjects." "Test subjects," I repeated, but the line had already gone quiet. When I turned back toward the kitchen, Lila was still standing by the counter, adjusting the dimmer on the lights as though it mattered. "Do you think it's too warm in here?" she asked. I didn't want it to feel fake fancy, but not like a cafeteria either. She looked up, and whatever she saw in my face stopped her words. She reached for my phone before I could hide it. Her thumb scrolled through the messages and the photo again. Paige's kids, not toddlers anymore, already halfway through their meals. My parents smiling with wine glasses raised. Lila's shoulders trembled first, then her face. Not a scream, not even tears, just a slow collapse of expression like air leaving a balloon. She set the phone down gently, afraid it might shatter. "I thought they'd at least try it," she said, her voice cracking around the edges. I moved to hug her, but she stepped back, blinking too fast. "I'm fine," she said again, but her voice sounded small. The smell of the kitchen turned heavy, sweet butter and sugar mixing with something that felt like loss. She wiped the spotless counter again and again, her movements automatic. I stood beside her, unsure what words could reach her. Then a sound from my phone broke through the stillness. A notification. Another one. I picked it up, expecting another photo, maybe another message, pretending everything was fine. Instead, it was a charge alert from my business card. The Sycamore Restaurant. $1,285. For a second, I couldn't breathe. They hadn't just skipped her dinner, they'd used my card to pay for theirs. My card, the one I kept for family emergencies. The same one they were supposed to have deleted months ago. A laugh escaped me, short, bitter, unsteady. Lila looked up, startled. "What is it?" "They used my card," I said quietly. "They made me pay for the dinner they replaced yours with." Her eyes widened, disbelief mixing with exhaustion. "They what?" I nodded, unable to form anything more. The kitchen fell silent again, except for the ticking of the oven timer. Lila turned away, pressing her palms against the counter. I could see her shoulders tighten, see the tremor that ran through her arms. "I don't understand," she said after a long pause. "Why would they?" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. I set the phone down and looked around the room. The table she'd dressed like a celebration, the candles still waiting to be lit, the cake that caught the light like glass. Every corner of that room held her effort, her heart. In that quiet, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let them do this to her, not the way they had done it to me for years. Not this time. I picked up my phone again, not to scroll, but to act. "Mark," I said when he answered, "can you come home right now?" He didn't ask why, he just said, "Give me 20 minutes. As I hung up, Lila was still standing there, eyes fixed on the cake. "We can't just let it sit here," she said softly. "We won't," I told her. "But we're not throwing it away either." She looked at me, then unsure what I meant. I didn't fully know myself yet, only that something in me had shifted. The part of me that used to stay quiet, that used to smooth things over, had finally run out of words. I turned off the oven, wiped my hands, and began to think of who else might still be awake, who might still care enough to come when family wouldn't. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space between us, low and steady, like a pulse starting to build again. Outside, the first cars of evening passed headlights sweeping across the window. I watched them fade down the street and knew that before the night ended, this house would not stay empty. Something was about to change. Lila didn't say another word that night. She stood by the counter rearranging silverware that didn't need rearranging, turning the dimmer switch up and down as if the right lighting could make sense of what had happened. The air in the kitchen still carried the sweetness of caramel and the bite of lemon zest, but it no longer felt warm. It felt like a waiting room after everyone's already left. I leaned against the doorway, watching her wipe the same spot on the counter again and again. "It's all spotless," I said softly. She nodded without looking up. "I know." The silence between us stretched until the oven timer clicked off its small sound, cutting through the room like a whisper we both heard too late. She pulled out a tray she'd already checked 3 times and set it down carefully. It should stay warm just in case, she murmured. "In case what?" Her hand stilled on the edge of the counter. "In case they changed their minds." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. When she finally sat down, her shoulders slumped forward, elbows resting on her knees. "Do you think Grandma even saw the menu?" she asked. "I printed it on the nice paper, the one you said feels like velvet. "I think she saw it," I said, because she had. They all had. They just hadn't cared. Lila looked toward the dining room where 23 chairs waited in perfect symmetry. The daffodils she'd picked that morning stood tall in their vases, bright against the white tablecloths. "I should have known," she whispered. I walked closer, wanting to reach for her, but afraid she'd pull away again. "You couldn't have known." She shook her head. "I could have. They always do this. They did it to you, too." Her words hit with quiet precision. I hadn't told her much about my childhood, only fragments. Still, she'd noticed the spaces between. I remembered sitting on our old couch as a girl, grease on my hands from fixing a broken radio, while my parents clapped for Paige as she spun in her recital dress. They'd told me to wash up before dinner, as if pride could be scrubbed away. That memory rose now, sharp and unwelcome. Lila stood and walked to the table. She straightened a napkin, adjusted a fork, touched the corner of a place card with her finger, the one that said Grandma Diane. She traced the letters, then let her hand fall. I thought of the times she'd asked about her future, about culinary school, about whether people could make a life out of feeding others. I'd told her yes, if you work hard and stay kind. Tonight, that kindness looked like a bruise. She turned toward me again. "What's wrong with us?" "Nothing," I said quietly. "We just expect people to show up when they say they will." Lila looked at the cake on the counter. "Do you think they even thought about how much time this took?" I didn't answer because I knew the truth. They hadn't. For them, time was something other people spent. Effort was invisible until it benefited them. Mark came through the door 20 minutes later, still in his work clothes. He took one look at the untouched plates and understood without asking. "They didn't come," he said, setting down his keys. "No," I replied. "They went to dinner at the Sycamore." He rubbed his jaw. "Of course they did." Then his eyes softened when he saw Lila. "Hey, kiddo," he said quietly. "You did everything right. This isn't on you." She didn't respond. She just walked back into the kitchen and started covering dishes with foil. "We can't waste it," she said, more to herself than to us. As she moved, I noticed how small she looked in her own kitchen, her dream space, the one she'd filled with color and warmth, where every pan and spice had a story. It all felt heavier now. Mark touched my arm gently. "Let's give her a minute." I nodded, but I couldn't step away. Watching her work through heartbreak in silence felt too familiar. It reminded me of every time I'd swallowed words I should have said, every time I'd accepted less just to keep peace. After a while, the house settled into stillness. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of the lights, the muffled sound of Lila moving dishes into neat rows, it all blended into a rhythm I knew too well, the rhythm of enduring. When she finally stopped, she leaned against the counter, eyes fixed on the cake again. "It's funny," she said softly. "I thought if I made something beautiful enough, they'd notice." Her voice cracked, barely a sound. I stepped forward and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "They should have. But they didn't." "No," I said, "they didn't." The clock ticked on, steady and cruel. I could feel the weight of every second she'd spent, measuring, stirring, hoping. And now all that love sat untouched on plates no one would ever lift. After she went to bed, I stayed in the kitchen, walking slow circles through the house we'd spent years making our own. Every object around me carried a piece of effort, her drawings on the fridge, the smell of baked sugar, the framed photos on the wall. They all belonged to a story of trying, of giving, of showing up. I sat down at the table and stared at the name cards again. 23 names written in gold ink, a map of people who chose not to come. My chest ached in a way that felt both old and new. For a moment, I could almost hear my mother's voice saying how I'd always been too sensitive, how people don't mean harm, they just forget. But this wasn't forgetting. This was deliberate, and it wasn't just about food, it was about value. The night stretched on. Outside, the streetlights threw long shadows across the porch. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then stopped. Inside, the oven clicked as it cooled. I picked up my phone again. The charge from the Sycamore was still there, staring back at me in numbers that felt like betrayal written in ink. My own parents had made me pay for their dinner, while my daughters sat untouched. I turned the phone face down and let out a long, quiet breath. the kind that empties everything left inside. When I finally checked on Lila, she was asleep on the couch, still wearing her apron. Her hands were curled near her chest as if she were holding something fragile. A faint smudge of chocolate streaked across her wrist. I pulled a blanket over her shoulders and brushed her hair back. "Not again," I whispered to the room. "Not this time." Mark found me there a little while later. "You okay?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "No, but I know what we're going to do." He waited patient the way he always did when I needed to gather my thoughts. I looked at the empty chairs, at the candles that had burned down without ever being lit, and something inside me settled into resolve. "They wanted silence," I said quietly. "They wanted us to pretend this didn't happen." "And we're not going to?" he asked. "No," I said, steady now. "We're not." Outside, a light drizzle had started tapping against the windows in small, even beats. It sounded like a promise, soft but sure. I didn't yet know how we would fix this, but I knew the first thing we needed to do was fill this house again. Not with the people who had hurt us, but with the ones who never asked for perfection, to feel welcome. As I turned off the kitchen lights, I caught one last glimpse of the cake in the dark. Its smooth lavender frosting caught the faint light from the window, glowing pale and quiet. It looked like something waiting not for applause, but for belonging. Tomorrow, I thought she'll wake up to something different. Tomorrow, we start again. The next morning came gray and quiet. A thin mist hung over the yard, softening the view beyond the kitchen window. I stood there with a mug of coffee gone cold, watching the light shift across the table Lila had spent hours setting. Everything was still in its place, as if the night hadn't happened. The daffodils leaned slightly now, their petals dulled at the edges. I didn't move them. I just watched the way the air seemed heavier around that room. Lila came downstairs slowly, her hair pulled into a loose braid, eyes red from a night that had offered no rest. She didn't look at the table. She went straight for the sink, filled a glass with water, and stood there drinking it as though it might clear something deeper than thirst. Mark joined us a few minutes later. He kissed her head gently, then looked at me. We didn't need words. We both knew this had crossed a line that couldn't be walked back. I took a breath, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. "Lila," I said softly, "I think we should invite some people over tonight." She turned confused. "For what?" "For dinner," I said. "The one you already made." Her brow furrowed. "Mom, no one's going to come on a whim." "They might," I said. "And if they don't, that's fine. But we're not letting all your work go unseen." She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's ruined." "They took that from me." I set the mug down. "Then we take it back." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was full, but not cold. Then she sighed and turned back to the sink, rinsing her glass with slow, deliberate movements. By the time Mark left for work, I had made up my mind. I went to the small office off the kitchen and opened my contact list. One by one, I began to dial. Not family, people who had been kind in small ways. Our neighbor Hank, who helped Mark fix the porch steps last summer. Becca from the co-op, who once dropped off soup when Lila had the flu. Owen, my cousin on my father's side, the one who'd been quietly pushed out of family gatherings years ago for speaking his mind. I didn't explain much, just the truth. Lila spent 3 days cooking for her grandmother's birthday, I told them. They canceled an hour before dinner and went out instead. "There's food for 23 people here. If you can come, please do." It wasn't an invitation. It was a lifeline. The first person to arrive was Nora from next door. She showed up before I'd even finished clearing the last of the foil from the trays. She had her teenage daughter with her and carried a bottle of red wine wrapped in a dish towel. "Heard you could use some company," she said, setting it on the counter. "We brought extra napkins, too." Lila was still upstairs when the doorbell rang again. Becca came with her son holding a bouquet of tulips she'd picked up from a gas station on the way. Then came the family from the co-op, their youngest balancing a plate of cookies covered in plastic wrap. By the time Owen arrived, the house was filling with the low, warm hum of voices, people helping rearranging chairs, setting out plates. When Lila came down, she stopped at the bottom of the stairs, eyes wide. "What's going on?" I wiped my hands on a towel and smiled at her. "We're having dinner," I said. She looked around at the crowd, uncertain, almost shy. "But "These aren't family. They are now," I said. Something in her face softened, but she didn't answer. She turned toward the kitchen, adjusting her apron. "If they're eating my food," she said, "I want it plated right." It started like that, a small sentence that shifted the air. She moved with quiet focus, checking temperatures, brushing glazes, setting each plate with care. Every so often she'd glance at me, as if to ask if this was really happening. Each time, I nodded. Half an hour later, the dining room looked transformed again. Not perfect this time, chairs borrowed from every corner of the house, a folding table pulled in from the garage but full. The laughter that filled the room felt real, unpracticed. Someone tuned the radio to a soft station in the background. As Lila stepped out with the first-course mini butternut tarts drizzled with sage cream, the room fell quiet. The guests watched as she moved from seat to seat, hands trembling slightly, eyes fixed on the plates. When everyone was served, they began to eat. A few murmurs started soft at first, then stronger. "Oh my, that crust," someone said. Another voice followed. "What's that flavor nutmeg I saw?" Lila paused at the edge of the room, uncertain what to do next. I nodded toward the kitchen and she disappeared behind the door, taking a slow, steadying breath before emerging again with the next dish. By the time the main course came out, herbed chicken roulade with lemon couscous, the air had changed completely. People were leaning in, talking between bites, asking about recipes. Someone started clapping when she returned with the sauce. The sound made her freeze for half a second, then smile. That was when the last guest arrived, a woman I didn't recognize. She carried a small camera bag and wore boots streaked with clay. She introduced herself quietly. "Tessa Clark," she said. "I write for the Asheville Chronicle. Someone from your co-op told me what happened. Mind if I take a few photos?" I hesitated, glancing toward Lila. She was too focused on plating to notice us. "Go ahead," I said. "You should taste the food too." Tessa didn't just taste. She took notes, snapped pictures, and asked about every ingredient. When she tried the rosemary tart, she leaned close and whispered, "She's better than half the chefs I've reviewed this year." I didn't reply. I just told her to tell Lila that herself. When dessert came out, a 3-layer lavender cake dusted with edible violets, the room erupted in applause before anyone even picked up a fork. The sound startled Lila so much she nearly dropped the knife. I caught her hand, steadying it. "You did this," I whispered. As she sliced the cake, a man I barely knew stood and raised his glass. To Lila, he said, voice loud enough to carry, "To the young woman who cooked a feast not for applause, but out of love. You made something beautiful tonight." Everyone rose with him, clinking glasses, clapping. Lila stood frozen for a moment, then smiled, the kind that reached her eyes. For the first time since the night before, she looked like herself again. Later, after everyone left, the house was quiet once more, but it felt different. The emptiness was warm now, full of echoes instead of silence. Lila sat on the couch, hair loose, apron, wrinkled eyes shining. She leaned her head against my shoulder. "They came," she said softly. "They did," I answered. She smiled faintly. "I think I finally cooked for the right people." Outside, the mist had lifted. The moonlight stretched across the yard, bright enough to touch the daffodils through the window. I reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "Get some sleep," I said. "Tomorrow might be busy." She tilted her head. Why, I smiled. Because news travels fast in a town like ours. She laughed once, tired but real, and I felt something in both of us settle. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was peace for the first time in a long while. What neither of us knew then was that the night's quiet wouldn't last long. Something else was coming, and it would arrive louder than any applause. By morning the night before already felt like a dream, too bright and too full to be real. The smell of roasted herbs and lemons still lingered in the house, clinging to the curtains and drifting through the halls. Every surface bore a quiet reminder of what had happened: stray forks, lipstick-smudged glasses, crumbs of cake that sparkled in the light. I moved through the kitchen, slowly gathering plates, running my fingers across the tablecloth, letting the warmth of it all settle into me. Lila slept late. When she finally came downstairs, her hair was loose and her voice raspy from exhaustion. "Did that really happen?" she asked, still half asleep. It did, I said. Every bit of it. She looked around the room as though taking inventory of the evidence. The flowers, the empty bottles, the chair someone had borrowed from the patio. It feels different in here, she said softly. It is different. She nodded, then smiled faintly. I didn't think anyone would come. They came, I said, stacking plates beside the sink, and they saw what you can do. As we cleaned, the doorbell rang. Lila froze. Do you think it's someone returning something? When I opened the door, I saw Tessa Clark standing there, the journalist from the Chronicle. She looked the same as last night, her camera bag slung across one shoulder, boots dusted with dried clay. I won't stay long, she said with a friendly smile. I just wanted to drop off something. She held out a small envelope. Inside was a thank you note neatly handwritten along with her business card. The photos turned out beautifully, she said, and I'd like to feature Lila in next weekend's food column if she's comfortable with that. Lila blinked wide-eyed. Really? Really, Tessa said. What you did last night, it was more than impressive. It was heart. Lila's hand trembled slightly as she took the card. Thank you, she whispered. Tessa smiled, gave a small nod, and left. We stood there in the doorway for a long moment, sunlight spilling in around us. I could see the spark returning to Lila's face, cautious but alive. The following days blurred together in the best possible way. Calls came in from people who'd attended asking for recipes or offering to buy extra desserts. Becca from the co-op stopped by to order a tart for her book club. Even Hank mentioned he'd posted about the dinner in the neighborhood group, and a few local caterers had messaged asking if Lila ever took commissions. Each time someone reached out, Lila's confidence grew a little more. She started sketching new menu ideas in her notebook, testing recipes with the same concentration she once saved for studying. The kitchen filled again with sound simmering, chopping the soft rhythm of her work. Then one afternoon I found her standing by the counter staring at her phone. Mom, she said quietly, the Chronicle article is up. I dried my hands and joined her. There it was, a headline about a young chef who turned rejection into something beautiful. Tessa's words were kind, but the photo said even more. Lila standing in our kitchen, sunlight, catching her hair, a plate of rosemary tarts in her hands. She looked older in that picture, calm and proud. The story spread faster than either of us expected. By evening, it had been shared dozens of times on local pages. People we didn't know commented praising her work and asking where they could taste her food. Messages poured in from nearby restaurants, small bakeries, even a wedding planner wanting to collaborate. It should have been perfect, but with every notification, a quiet worry grew in the back of my mind. My parents and Paige would see it. They read the Chronicle. They'd recognize the names, the house, the details. I didn't know what they'd do with that knowledge, only that they wouldn't stay silent for long. Still, that night was peaceful. Mark came home early, and the three of us sat outside with leftover cake and tea, watching the porch light catch the last of the fireflies. Lila talked about applying again to Coastal Carolina Culinary Institute. Maybe they'll take me this year, she said. Even if they don't, I want to try. They'll see your name soon enough, Mark said. Anyone who tastes your food will. Lila smiled, setting her plate down carefully. It feels like I'm finally cooking for the right reasons, she said. Not to impress anyone, just because it makes me happy. I didn't know it yet, but that sentence would echo in my head hours later, after the night quieted after we'd said goodnight, because the peace that had filled the house was about to shatter. It started just past 2 a.m, a pounding on the front door, hard and deliberate. I sat up instantly, my heart racing. Mark stirred beside me. What is that? The sound came again, sharper this time. I slipped on a robe and went downstairs, Mark a step behind me. Through the frosted glass, I saw silhouettes, 3 of them. My parents stood side by side, their posture stiff and familiar. And just behind them, arms crossed, was Paige. I opened the door halfway, the night air cold against my face. It's late, I said. My father didn't waste a second. You need to fix this, he said sharply. Fix what? The article, my mother said, her voice tight. You let that journalist make us look like monsters. I blinked. We didn't let her do anything. She wrote the truth. Paige stepped forward, her voice calm but cutting. You need to call her and tell her it was exaggerated. You know how this looks." "How it looks," I repeated. "You left my daughter alone on her grandmother's birthday. You made me pay for your dinner. That's what it looks like." My father's face turned red. "Everyone at church has seen it. The neighbors are talking. My golf group won't even return my calls." "That's unfortunate," I said evenly, though my hands trembled. "But it's not my problem." Paige's tone sharpened. "You're making a spectacle out of nothing. She's a kid, Nora. You're teaching her to humiliate her own family." Mark stepped closer, then his voice calm but steady. "Enough. You're not doing this in our home." But they didn't move. My mother's voice rose brittle with anger. "We raised you better than this. You don't air family business in public." "You did that when you walked out," I said. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Behind me, a faint sound made us all turn. Lila was standing in the hallway wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide and stunned. My mother saw her and pointed trembling. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she said. That was it. I stepped between them before the words could cut deeper. "You need to leave," I said firmly. My father scoffed. "This is a family matter." "No." Mark said, his voice low but certain. "This is our home, and you don't get to come here to hurt her twice." For a long moment no one moved. Then Paige muttered something under her breath and turned toward the door. My parents followed their footsteps hard against the porch. The door slammed behind them, shaking the frame. In the silence that followed, I could hear Lila breathing slow, uneven. Mark went to her first, his hand steady on her shoulder. She didn't speak, just leaned against him, exhausted. I pulled back the curtain and looked outside. Across the street, Hank Porter stood on his lawn, his phone in hand, the screen glowing. He'd seen everything. I didn't know it then, but by morning that video would spread faster than any article. And for once, the truth would speak louder than any of their excuses. The next morning, sunlight barely touched the blinds before my phone began to buzz. At first, I thought it was the alarm. Then I saw the screen notifications stacked one after another, each from local groups' pages and neighbors. Hank's video was everywhere. The title read, "Grandparents from the viral teen chef story just showed up screaming at her house." The clip was only a minute long, but it didn't need to be longer. It showed everything. The shouting, my father's red face, my mother's finger pointing toward Lila, and the moment Mark stepped forward to block them. No sound could soften what was there. By the time I reached the kitchen, Lila was already awake, sitting at the counter with a blanket around her shoulders. Her phone glowed in front of her, the same clip playing over and over. "They're calling them bullies," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the screen. "And they're right." Her voice trembled, but not from fear this time. It was disbelief at being seen. The comments poured in beneath the video faster than we could read them. People from town, strangers from nearby cities, even local business owners. "Who yells at a teenager over a cake?" one wrote. "This poor girl deserved better," said another. Someone had already tagged Tessa's article, calling it proof of what the video showed. I poured 2 mugs of coffee and slid one toward Lila. She wrapped her hands around it but didn't drink. "Are they going to be madder now?" she asked. "They already were," I said. The truth just made it harder for them to hide. She nodded slowly, then put her phone face down on the counter. "I don't want to see it anymore," she whispered. By mid-morning, the video had crossed into community news pages, then regional ones. My work phone rang twice with reporters asking for statements. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The story was already telling itself. At lunch, Mark came home early. He'd seen it too. Someone had shown him at the shop. He placed his phone on the table. The same video paused at the frame where Lila's face appeared behind me in the hallway. "You don't have to respond to any of this," he said gently. "Let them talk." But I knew silence was what had let things like this fester for years. I wasn't going to let it shape her story again. I logged into my business account, the same one my parents had used to pay for that dinner, and wrote a single post. "We stand by every word and every truth. We're done protecting people who hurt our daughter." Then I hit share and set the phone down. The effect was immediate. Messages came flooding in support from friends I hadn't spoken to in years, old customers, even strangers who'd read about the dinner in Tessa's column. "You did the right thing," one wrote. "No one should have to keep family secrets that cruel." Among the flood of messages was one that made me stop cold. It wasn't a comment, it was an email addressed to Lila. The subject line read, "From the Culinary Institute." She opened it beside me, holding her breath. A representative from coastal Carolina had read Tessa's article and seen the video. They invited her to visit the campus over the summer to spend a week shadowing instructors and sitting in on classes. Lila's hands flew to her mouth. "Mom," she said softly, reading the line again. "They know my name." Mark grinned, pulling her into a hug. "Of course they do. It wasn't a formal offer, not yet, but it was something bigger. It was the world beginning to notice what her own family had tried to erase." That evening I cooked dinner while Lila sat at the table writing a reply to the school. Every few minutes, she stopped to think, chewing the end of her pen, her hair falling into her face. When she finished, she read it aloud. It was polite, humble, and hopeful, all the things she'd carried quietly since she was little. After we ate, I checked my messages one more time. There were new ones waiting this time from my parents. Short, bitter, filled with demands. "You've ruined us. We'll take legal action. This is elder abuse." I deleted each one without answering. Then I opened the joint account my father had once accessed and removed the last trace of their connection to it. That card, the one they'd used for their dinner, was gone for good. Outside, dusk settled in. Fireflies blinked across the yard, and the world for a brief moment felt balanced again. Lila leaned against the doorway, a cup of cocoa in her hand. "Do you think this will all go away now?" she asked. "Maybe not," I said. "But that's not always a bad thing." She smiled faintly. "It feels strange being the story everyone's talking about." "You're not the story," I said, meeting her eyes. "You're the reason it's worth listening." For the first time in years, the silence in the house didn't feel heavy. It was full alive with possibility. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail with an embossed seal. It was from Coastal Carolina Culinary Institute confirming Lila's invitation to attend their summer program and waiving all associated costs. They called it a full merit scholarship preview. When she read it, she covered her face and laughed through tears. "I don't even know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Mark said. She did. That night, while Lila slept, I sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. Across the street, Hank's porch light glowed, and I could see him out there still answering questions on the video thread, clarifying facts, correcting rumors. A small, steady defense of the truth. It struck me how fast everything had changed in a matter of days. The pain, the exposure, the unexpected kindness. What had started as a dinner meant to break her spirit had become something entirely different. When morning came, we packed a small box of samples for her upcoming campus visit, baked tarts, lemon bars, and a handwritten menu. She tied each ribbon herself, careful and focused. As we loaded them into the car, she looked back at the house. "I think I finally understand something," she said quietly. "They didn't ruin anything. They just showed me who to cook for." Her words settled deep inside me. For so long, I had believed peace meant distance, that walking away was the only form of strength left. But watching her that morning, I realized it was more than that. Peace was choosing. Choosing where your energy goes. Choosing who deserves your care. The day she left for the culinary program, we stood in the driveway as the car pulled away. Her window rolled down, her hair blowing in the summer wind. She waved until we were out of sight. I didn't cry then. Not because I wasn't proud, but because pride was too small a word for what I felt. I went back inside, passing through the same kitchen where it had all begun, the one that once smelled of disappointment and now held the faint trace of vanilla and lemon. On the counter sat the last thank you note she'd written addressed to Tessa Clark. The house was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. It was the kind that follows something healed, the kind that waits for the next chapter. I thought we'd reached the end of it then, that the storm had passed. But a week later, another message arrived, one that reminded me some people never let go of control without a fight. And this time it wasn't just words. The message arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was sorting laundry when the notification pinged a new email from an address I didn't recognize. At first I thought it was another article request, or maybe a stranger offering praise for Lila's story, but the subject line made my stomach tighten. Formal inquiry regarding Chronicle coverage. The message was brief but pointed. It claimed to be from an attorney representing my parents asking for clarification regarding the statements made to the Asheville Chronicle and subsequent reputational damage. Attached was a PDF titled Intent to Seek Damages. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, staring at the words until they blurred. Mark was sanding a chair in the garage. I walked out with the phone in my hand. "They're threatening to sue," I said. He wiped his hands on his jeans and took the phone. "For what?" "Telling the truth." I shook my head. "They're calling it defamation. Said we cost them social and financial standing." He read the message twice before setting the phone down on the workbench. "They won't follow through," he said calmly. "They just want to scare you." "Maybe," I said quietly. "But they always find ways to make us pay." That night, I forwarded the email to Tessa, asking if the Chronicle had received anything similar. Her reply came within the hour. "We've already seen it. Our legal department reviewed the article. It's fully factual. You and Lila are protected. Don't engage with them directly." Relief and dread tangled inside me. I deleted the email chain, but couldn't stop replaying the thought of my parents sitting across some lawyer's desk, telling him how cruelly we'd humiliated them. I wondered if they really believed it, or if this was just one last reach for control. The next day, while I was at the shop, a call came through from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Mrs. Bennett," a man's voice said. "This is Dean Whitmore from Coastal Carolina Culinary Institute. I wanted to follow up regarding Lila's upcoming visit." My chest eased for the first time that morning. "Yes, of course. We received your letter. She's thrilled." "I'm glad to hear that," he said warmly. "I wanted to let you know we've expanded the visit into a formal pre-admissions program. It's a small group, mostly scholarship candidates. Her article reached our faculty, and they're eager to meet her." I thanked him until my voice caught. After we hung up, I sat behind the counter for a long while, the sound of the street outside muffled by the weight of gratitude. That evening, Lila and I baked lemon bars to celebrate. She sifted powdered sugar over the top with careful precision. "Mom," she said suddenly, "do you think Grandma and Grandpa are still mad?" I hesitated. "Probably." She nodded, sprinkling sugar until it looked like frost. "I used to think if I worked hard enough, they'd have to see me," she said softly. "But now I'm glad they didn't come. If they had, none of this would have happened." I didn't argue. She was right. Sometimes absence builds more than presence ever could. A few days later, the Chronicle ran a follow-up story, not about the family drama, but about the unexpected wave of community support for young chefs in the region. Tessa had mentioned several names, but Lila's photo appeared at the top again, her smile calm and steady, her apron dusted with flour. It wasn't long before a small restaurant downtown called The Gathered Table reached out, inviting her to spend part of the summer helping in their kitchen before school started. When she showed me the message, her hands shook with excitement. "They said I could assist the pastry chef," she whispered. "Can I say yes?" "Of course," I said. "Say yes." Her joy filled the house in ways words couldn't. For weeks, she worked quietly, leaving early and coming home late, smelling faintly of sugar and citrus. She started a small blog posting photos of her dishes and short notes about what she was learning. The followers came slowly at first, then all at once. But peace, even the honest kind, never stays untouched for long. One Friday evening, I was closing up the shop when my phone rang again, another number I didn't know. This time it was Owen, my cousin. "You might want to check your parents' church bulletin," he said carefully. "They printed something about you. About Lila." He texted me a photo a moment later. It was a small announcement tucked between event listings and prayer requests. It read, "We ask for understanding and forgiveness for our family as we endure the pain of false accusations made public by certain individuals. May grace lead them back to truth." I felt my throat tighten. They hadn't used our names, but they didn't have to. The town was small. People would know. When I showed Mark, he rubbed the back of his neck. "They're trying to rewrite the story again," he said. "Pretend they're the victims." I sat at the table, turning the phone over in my hands. "I don't want Lila to see this. She won't," he said. "And even if she does, she knows better now. But she did see it later that weekend when someone tagged her blog in a thread defending her. She came to me with tears in her eyes, but not from sadness. "They're never going to say sorry, are they?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, some people don't know how." She stood there for a moment, her hands folded tight. "Then I guess I'll stop waiting for it." That night I watched her sit at her desk typing something slowly. She posted a photo of her latest dessert, a simple pear tart glazed with honey. Beneath it, she wrote one line, "Cooking taught me that sweetness isn't forgiveness, it's balance." Within hours, her words spread farther than anything before. The local paper quoted her post in a feature about young entrepreneurs. The Culinary Institute reposted it on their student spotlight page. My parents stayed silent after that. Paige sent one text, a single sentence. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" I didn't reply. By the time August came, the noise had faded. The lawsuit threats vanished. The church moved on to new gossip. And Lila, she kept building. On her last night before leaving for the Institute, we sat in the backyard, the air heavy with the scent of late summer. Mark grilled vegetables while I poured cider into glasses. Lila looked out toward the dark tree line, quiet but content. "Do you think they'll ever come around?" she asked softly. Maybe I said, "But if they don't, you'll still have us." She smiled, her face lit by the glow of the patio lights. "That's enough." We ate together under the same stars that had hung above every hard moment, the ones that had watched her fall and rise again. The night felt whole, not because everything was fixed, but because she no longer needed it to be. Before she went to bed, she turned back to me in the doorway. "Mom, yes, I'm not scared anymore." I nodded. "Good. You don't have to be." When her door closed, the house filled with that soft kind of silence, the one that feels earned. I sat for a long time in the living room, looking at the framed photo from her community dinner. She'd signed it at the bottom, in small, looping letters. "Thank you for believing in me." It was then I realized something had shifted for good. The power my parents once held over us was gone, not because they'd changed, but because we had. Still, part of me wondered how long their quiet would last. Because with my family, silence was never peace. It was preparation. The quiet I'd been waiting for came at last, not the uneasy kind that follows conflict, but the stillness of a life realigned. Weeks after Lila left for school, the house felt different. It wasn't emptier, just softer, like it had exhaled. Her room stayed neat, except for the apron draped over her chair, still dusted with flour. I left it there. It reminded me that something beautiful had taken root in the space where old pain used to live. One afternoon, I drove out to visit her campus. The road to the Institute curved along the coast sunlight, flickering through rows of live oaks. When I arrived, I found her in a test kitchen, sleeves rolled up, eyes steady on a sauce she was whisking. The room buzzed with energy students moving like a well-rehearsed orchestra, but she stood calm in the middle of it all. When she saw me, she smiled in a way that told me she was exactly where she belonged. After class, we walked across the courtyard, sharing a carton of strawberry ice cream she'd made for a dessert lab. She told me about her instructors, the long hours, the pressure, and the joy. "It's hard work," she said, "but it feels right." I could hear the strength in her voice, the kind that grows when someone finally stops apologizing for who they are. She paused for a moment, looking out toward the ocean. "Do you ever think they'll reach out again?" she asked quietly. "I think they already have," I said. "Just not in a way that matters." She nodded, understanding. Neither of us needed to name them anymore. Some stories close not with confrontation, but with distance that feels like peace. When I got home that night, a letter waited in the mailbox. The handwriting stopped me cold, my mother's looping and familiar. Inside was a short note written in her careful, formal script. "We've moved. Please don't contact us again. We wish you well. No apology, no warmth, just finality." I folded the letter and set it in a drawer beside old family photos I no longer displayed. There was a time that message would have broken me. But standing in my own kitchen, surrounded by quiet that no longer hurt, I felt something closer to relief. They hadn't changed, but I had. Months passed, and the world kept turning. Lila's name began appearing in places we never expected on local food blogs, then in a regional magazine that called her a young chef to watch. The Chronicle ran a follow-up story tracing how one small dinner in a neighborhood kitchen had sparked something larger than any of us imagined. She came home for the holidays that winter, confident and radiant, her hands a little rough from work and her heart steadier than ever. On Christmas Eve, we cooked side by side roasted lamb, honey-glazed carrots, and the same lavender cake she'd once made for her grandmother. This time we ate it together by the fire, just the three of us. Mark raised his glass. "No guest to disappoint us this year," he said with a grin. Lila laughed, the sound light and free. "No," she said, "just the ones who belong." We sat for a long while after dinner, the room filled with warmth and the scent of sugar and thyme. Outside, the night stretched calm and clear. Inside, there was nothing left to prove. I thought about how far we'd come, the years of bending to please people who only took the weight of silence mistaken for peace the night she nearly threw away her dream. Justice hadn't come through anger or revenge. It came through boundaries, through choosing better company, through the quiet courage of saying no more. Before bed, I stepped out to the porch. The stars hung bright above the yard, the same ones that had watched every step of our undoing and rebuilding. I thought about my parents, wherever they were living inside a story they'd rewritten for themselves. I wished them well from afar and let the thought drift away. Inside the house glowed with soft light. Lila's laughter echoed faintly from the kitchen, blending with the clink of dishes and the hum of Mark's voice. For the first time I understood what real peace sounded like. It wasn't silence. It was the sound of love unthreatened. As I turned out the porch light, I caught my reflection in the window and hardly recognized the woman looking back. She stood taller, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes unguarded. For years I'd mistaken strength for endurance, but it wasn't. Real strength was gentler. It was choosing yourself even when others didn't. Lila would start her internship soon, a new step in a life she'd built with her own two hands. And me, I was learning finally to live without waiting for the next storm. If you've ever had to rebuild after being torn down, I hope this story finds you. Maybe you'll remember that peace isn't found in keeping everyone close. Sometimes it's in letting go and knowing who deserves a seat at your table. And if you've ever stood where I once stood between love and self-respect, choose the one that lets you breathe. Because that's where healing begins. If this story stayed with you tonight, share it with someone who might need to hear it too. And wherever you're listening from, I hope you find your own kind of peace.